Whether you're looking to land your next promotion, make a career transition, or find the next best role for you, being a job candidate can be challenging.
And even sometimes isolating, but you don't have to do it alone.
I'm Karen Weeks, the CEO and Chief Career Coach of Shine at Work Coaching. I bring over 20 years of HR experience to the conversation, including as the Chief People Officer at Order Groove.
And I'm Dan Carr, a Shine at Work career coach with over a decade of recruiting experience, helping high-growth startups expand with top talent.
On this podcast, we will shine a light on your job search so you can land a role that lets you flex your strengths and progress your career in an environment you actually look forward to working in each day.
From creating a standout resume, to confidently negotiating your salary, to find your footing as a new manager, you can expect to hear actionable advice to help you shine your brightest in your role.
This is the Shine at Work podcast. Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Shine at Work. I'm Karen Weeks, and I am, as always, here with my co-host, Dan Carr. Good to see you, sir.
Good to see you, as always.
Today, we are here to talk to you about startups. So if anyone knows our background, we both have a lot of experience being in startups. We both love those stages of companies that are trying to figure things out and then building and growing and adjusting. And it's a really fun place to be if it's right for you. And I think so many startups or startups that had the rocket ship success or maybe the rocket ship decline are in the news. And so you think like, oh, it's so cool to work for a startup. And so we have clients that come to us and say, I used to work at a big company. I want to make the move to startup. How do I do that? And so we thought it'd be a good episode to talk to folks if you're considering applying for a startup, whether you have that background or not. What does that actually mean and what do startups look for? Because that might help you land the job that you're looking for in a startup. So first, let's just kind of talk about what startup is, because I think bigger companies that used to be startups still have the brand of a startup, but maybe they're not there anymore. So we are not business acumen experts. Like, we're not going to go through the literal definitions of things, but just to kind of give people a rough outline if you're not familiar with it. So with startups, you can be wicked early stage, 10 people, maybe you've done a little bit of fundraising, maybe it's called like Series A, where you get like sort of your first investor, or you could be further along where you have a little more money, you've got market fit, product fit, you've got some customers, but you're still behaving in that field because either your industry is new, you're still sort of figuring things out, even though you've got some foundation. So one thing we always encourage people is, how early of a startup do you want to be in? And we've both been in different stages of startups.
Yeah, I think I've run the gambit from 10 people to, that 250, 300 person, and it can be very different.
Yeah, and often startups are trying to build themselves to a valuation where something then happens. They go IPO, they get acquired, they acquire someone else. So often a startup has some sort of exit plan. Instead of like a small business that just wants to stay small, wants to stay private, is just sort of like living at that stage of, this is what we do, we're staying sort of here. A startup is looking to gain that momentum so they can have some sort of big splashy exit, which doesn't always happen and a lot of times doesn't happen, but that's usually the goal and the energy. The other thing that we wanted to sort of call out is that startups don't have to be tech. So again, a lot of the stuff in the news tends to be tech startups. But a startup is really any forming company. I mean, technically, you could say our coaching business is a startup because we're a forming company. So that's the other thing that people may want to consider is the default is often like tech startup, but it doesn't have to be in the tech space. It could be healthcare. It could be anything. Thinking about what startup culture means. So this is also something that we talk to our clients a lot about is, okay, there's work hard, play hard. There's like work-life balance. What does that all mean? They have free beer and ping pong and like all the stuff that used to exist probably more before COVID. But what is a good culture? And so often we'll work with clients to figure out, well, what matters to you the most? Is it flexibility? Is it relationships? Is it innovation? And then finding that in a culture that's really important to you.
One of the more important things to consider and the benefits of a startup that I've found is impact. Like, what kind of impact do you want your work to have, like your 9 to 5, the energy and the blood, sweat, and tears that you're pouring into it. Like there are a lot of pros and cons to the startup world, but that's probably the biggest pro is, you will walk into an environment like you're talking about. We're figuring it out. There's not the same amount of resources that you might have in a larger company. There's not the same set processes, but that means you get to build all those things. You get to see um, the essentially the impact of what you're doing usually is right in front of you. 6 months later, you can see the thing, or the product or the process or the initiative that you built out really affect either the bottom line, the good or negative way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is one thing that I know when I interview people coming from bigger companies, I say, like, we don't have this thing yet. You're going to help us figure it out. And there have been people that I've worked with in past companies that sort of grew with the company. And I'm like, we have to go back to those earlier stages. Or maybe they worked at a company that still called themselves a startup, but they were actually over 500 people. So they
Mhm.
had a team of 5 doing something that's very different than being the first.
Yep.
And so that's another thing to really think about is, do I want to be the first of something, or do I want to join maybe a smaller team and maybe I'm number 3 on that team, because those are 2 very different experiences.
That's something as you're going into the process, if you are making a transition from a bigger company to really dig into in the interview process and the fact finding of understanding like what is the reality of what you are walking into and what do the resources look like what is set in stone, what's not set in stone, and it kind of paints the picture for you as far as like what what your day to day is going to look like and how much energy you're going to need to be pouring into the role.
Yeah. And one thing I always tell people is that there's no right or wrong answer. It's what do you enjoy and what do you expect? So if you like being a builder, awesome, go to an earlier stage company. If you like focusing more on scaling, maybe that's more like the middle of the road. If you want to have things sort of set and like, here's the playbook, now go do the playbook, that's probably later on.
Yep.
And by the way, there can be different teams at different stages within a company. So these are all things that, again, joining a startup is awesome, but you need to ask yourselves these questions to make sure you get to the right startup.
Probably one of the more important things, which we'll probably talk a little bit more about as we go through this, is it's certainly sort of paramount to me in considering startups and working at startups is, do you actually believe in the mission or the product of the company? Because that can answer a lot of those questions that you're asking. Like, do you want to are you a builder? Yes, but are you a builder for this? Do you believe in this? Are you passionate about this? Are you willing to go those extra steps? Are you willing to, work on a team that doesn't quite have the resources go through the blood, sweat, and tears of dealing with ambiguity or things changing on a dime. And if you can drill it down to, do I believe in this product or the mission, the impact that this company is trying to make? It's usually probably one of the more important questions that you can ask yourself in making this transition.
Yeah. And I think to that point too, around the ambiguity piece, it also may be your job is really big in the beginning. Like you may be doing a lot of things because they haven't gotten to the specialist stage yet. So do you like to be a specialist where you sort of do, just taking HR, for example, like I handle training within HR and that's all I'm expected to do? Or am I going to be more of a generalist where I'm handling recruiting, benefits, employee relations, training, office management, event coordination, and so thinking about how much do you like to focus versus do you like having all those different things on your plate? And it may not stay that way always. Like as the team grows, maybe you get some help, but those are also different things of not only where do you want to focus and what do you want to focus on, but do you have the skills to kind of like sort of cover or maybe BS your way through some of those other hats that you have to wear?
Yep, totally. But you bring up a good point too, is that doesn't mean that's how it's going to be, but that's something that you really want to, as you're researching and you're interviewing with the company and you're making a decision whether or not you want to make this transition, is really understanding, do they have a hiring plan built out for this team that you're joining? Like, okay, you're going to come on and you're going to be the pillar that holds up this entire piece of the org, but you also have 6 people that you can hire over the course of the next 3 quarters, and you can build that out. So that's always a very enticing piece of like,
Yeah.
okay, I'm going to have to do all these things, but I also get to essentially build the structure and the team around it, which will eventually support me.
That's a
But
great point. Yeah.
no, I was just going to say asking them and making sure that they have that set in stone of like, will I have headcount? What will
Mm,
that look like? How are you planning around that? What's the budget look like? Um, are pretty important elements instead of just hearing the like, oh yeah, I'm sure, you can hire some people or we'll figure it out, are things you might want to look a little bit more definition around.
yeah.
Sorry to
I
interrupt
mean,
you.
no, no, I think it's a great point because I think also, especially if you're more senior, it may be that you actually have to start as an individual contributor to build out the team.
Mhm.
And then you're more of a individual contributor to a player coach, then the more like traditional manager where you're more strategy and you've got the team executing, but that might be a path. And so a lot of times when I talk to people joining a team, especially if it's an earlier stage team within the organization, it's like, yeah, it's you, period. Or maybe it's you and this other person, but here's the plan to build that out. And you get the opportunity to do that. But if I've been a manager for a while, I have to decide, am I comfortable going back to be potentially the sole person on the team doing all the things until I can build out that team?
Yeah, and that can be a pretty big change for someone
Yeah.
coming from a big corporation that's had, oh, this we delegate to
Yeah.
this team or this team member or this part of the funnel handles that. And when it's all on your shoulders, excuse me, it's a pretty different world. So
Yeah.
understanding what you're up for and what the realities will be is
Yeah.
pretty essential.
Yeah. And I think that goes into when you're interviewing with a company, asking questions around how do you set priorities? How do you collaborate so that something doesn't all fall on someone's shoulders? And those might be clues into how they identify what's important. How do they identify work life integration kind of stuff? So, some other things that might be important to you that maybe are not in the role, but will help you from burning out or have the team, do they recognize that this is sort of like a team of one right now?
Yeah, and we talk a lot about just in interview prep in general,
Mhm.
like understanding the expectations for the role, and I think that's so essential
Yeah.
in this type of scenario. Understanding if you're a one-person show, what their expectation is that you're accomplishing in the first 6 months or 12 months,
Mhm.
along with like, do you get to build a team along with that and gain some resources to achieve that goal, or are you handling everything and also they have got this pie in the sky goal that you need to hit as well that might not be realistic and you might be setting yourself up for failure.
Yeah. Yeah. And I actually want to rewind to something that you said about believing in the mission of the company.
Mhm.
Depending on the stage, you also want to get a good sense of the founder and or the leaders. So the founder may still be a leader, maybe they've hired a team around them, maybe not, like, but better understanding the values and the founder and understanding what the founder's role is within the company, because sometimes that's wicked inspiring. And especially if you're earlier stage, you're probably going to have a lot more interaction with that founder. But if it's later stage, maybe there's enough layers of leadership that may not be as still day to day. But that's another thing to kind of do this. Has this founder done this before? Or, I worked at one company where the founders literally were fresh out of grad school. So they hired leaders around them and they were leaders of a department, but they hired a CEO that was not one of the founders because they were like, yeah, we don't know what we're doing. Like we
Mhm.
need we need a grown up to help us here. Other founders want to grow with the company and stay as the founder and CEO. So just sort of understanding what that background is, especially again, if it's sort of more earlier stage, because you're going to be very connected to that person.
Yeah, and understanding how they think about hiring. I think some of the best leaders that I've worked
Mhm.
for have really demonstrated self-awareness
Yeah.
that like I'm not a marketing expert, I'm not an
Mhm.
engineering expert, so on and so forth. So, you know, I have a vision, but I know that I need to bring other people in to
Yes.
essentially lean on to build this business as opposed to I've worked in other startups where, you know, you've got the CEO that's got their hands in everything because
Yeah.
they essentially think they're the expert. So point being is just if you can get that opportunity to get in front of that person, especially in a smaller organization during the interview process, it can really help paint the picture for you of what you're
Yes.
walking into and what the future will look like.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know we just dumped a ton of information about like these are things you should be considering if you're thinking about going to a startup, all the different stages and what's important and all those things, especially if you're not coming from other startups. Let's kind of flip it and now say, okay, so what are startups looking for in candidates so that I can be presenting myself as the best candidate possible? So one thing I know that I always am looking for is that ambiguity piece. Like, do you understand that we may be going one direction and not that we're just going to spin around for no reason, but if we get new data, that may change. And so that dealing with ambiguity or not having all the information necessary when you start a project, like that's something that when I'm hiring, I really look for within a candidate. What have been some of the things in your experience that you've looked for candidates for startups?
Yeah, I mean, that is definitely a number one is having somebody that's comfortable with being able to move the ball forward without having maybe all the answers or everything fleshed out, and essentially being able to navigate that world and figure out a way to get some momentum moving forward as you kind of figure it out along the way. I think another piece is being able to turn on a dime. So one thing you're working on that you're pouring all your your heart and soul into for 3 months may change focus, and you may get direction of like, okay, that's no longer the direction that we're going in. Can you stop that immediately and start working on X, Y, and Z? And that can be, that can have an emotional toll. So really understanding if a candidate has gone through a similar experience or is prepared for that type of scenario
Mhm.
is always essential in sort of interviewing through a startup.
Yeah, I do a whole training and workshop on whiplash, like how to help people through change. Because even if people are totally bought in and they're like, yep, that's the right thing to do, to your point, helping them make that shift and go through the emotions of that shift is so key. So if you're very flexible and be like, okay, well, that was disappointing because I really like that thing, but I get it now I'm over here,
Mhm.
then that will be key because again, it doesn't even mean something was wrong. It's just new data in the market or new customer feedback. We have enough of it that says, I think we need to be thinking about this differently.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And then just to drill down a little bit further, like I'm mentioning resources, but understanding that someone is resourceful, can
Mhm.
sort of lean into things when you don't have the budget to hire someone for a certain specialty.
Mhm.
And understanding that they have that flexibility to until you get to that stage where you can grow and build a team, can sort of lean into things and won't just throw up their arms and say, I can't manage this, because instead of
Mhm.
how can we, is there, okay, we can't hire someone, but is there an opportunity to bring a short-term outside consultant into the situation? Like, is someone thinking on their toes and resourceful in a situation is always super helpful too.
Yeah. Yep, absolutely. Well, and I think sort of continuing to sort of build on this because it's all very similar, but it
Mhm.
presents itself in different ways is like problem solving and being solution oriented.
Yep.
Because again, there are going to be surprises. You're going to go down one direction and learn that that wasn't netting the result that you were expecting. You may run into a roadblock or a surprise. And so, how do you work with each other to say, okay, this wasn't what we thought, or we learned something new. What now? And you can't just go, I don't know. Or, well, that's your problem. Good luck with that. Like it has to be much more collaborative, solution oriented, problem solving. So that might be another thing that like comes up in interviews
Yep.
of examples that you've had to deal with that.
Yeah, and also something that kind of rings throughout, no matter what position that you're in, is this somebody that's data driven? Um,
Mm,
can you support sort of strategies and initiatives that you want to focus on or you think is the right direction for your team or something that you're working on with some data? It's important in this world of moving very quickly, not having all the resources. Usually data is the backbone or the backbone that a lot of companies are trying to build as being their decision-making process. So having some experience with that, being able to speak to different scenarios where they've leaned into the data to make a decision is always pretty important too.
Yeah, no, that's a great one. And I think to your point, data is always important, but especially when you're trying to decide if something is working. So
Mhm.
again, even if you're at like a 200-person company and you've got a product market fit, you're still adding new features, or you're trying to expand the market, or you're trying to do whatever, or you're looking for adoption, or you're looking for usability, or whatever the different things are. Like, you're going to always be asked, why should we be making that decision, no matter what stage you're at?
Yeah. And because as you were mentioning, there's usually such close collaboration, people working in different expertises, but data tends to be sort of a universal language that makes communication easier and makes collaboration easier as you're trying to move quickly within a
Yeah.
startup.
Yep, absolutely. And I think the final thing, and this has gotten some bad raps in the past with startups, is, you know, liking the people you work with, because it is probably smaller teams. It is probably more collaborative. So it does not mean, do I want to have a beer with this person? It does not mean they need to have the same background and the things that hurt, diversity, both of thought and of people. But there is probably going to be a culture interview. There's probably going to be a team interview, something like that, to say, does this person balance us out? Does this person, are they going to be easy to work with? Are they bringing new ideas to the table? Are they the things that we just talked about? So don't be surprised if an HR person, a peer, someone is doing some sort of quote unquote culture interview.
Yeah, and I mean it's so important, and it's usually especially in a startup, like one of as a recruiter, almost a number one thing. Obviously, you're looking to check all the boxes as far as hard and soft skills, but I would even say that you're going to see at least throughout the entire interview process. Generally, it's going to be half of what the recruiter is focused on, or 25% of what the recruiter is focused on a phone screen. And then, as you're meeting subsequent people, they're doing a little bit of a gut check as far as culture fit too. So I'd say you want to go into the situation understanding what the culture is and seeing if it's right for you before you're sort of entering that process, because they will certainly be checking for it.
Yeah, absolutely. So, two final things we wanted to talk about if you're thinking about joining a startup, especially if you're coming from a different company. So, first of all, is how do I rebrand myself? So, you and I have hired in these companies, and we know when we see a big name company, we're like, oh, they're not going to get us. And so we hesitate. So, if I'm coming from that big name company, which some of our clients have and have successfully made the transition to a startup, how can I best brand myself to say, don't be scared by the big name company. I know I can do this.
I mean, for me, I know I beat this drum a lot, but it's going back to establishing some sort of connection to the mission or the product of the company, because um, as we've talked a lot about, like startup teams are smaller. There's a lot of close collaboration, and they can be risky.
Mhm.
Um, so you want to know that everyone is sort of on the same page and they believe in what you're working towards. So you can do that in a lot of different ways. As far as in your cover letter, I'm always telling people to start your cover letter off of why you're connected to this company. Like, startups want to hear that, recruiters want to hear it, of like, okay, I know this person's coming from here, but they're actually an avid user of our product, or they shared this anecdote of why the mission is super important to them. And I think it's worth at least having a conversation with them. And that's all you need. You need that first conversation, get your foot in the door, but really establishing your connection to that is can be very make or break in those scenarios.
Yeah. And I think helping them relate to what you have done. So, my two biggest success stories of someone who came from a really big company, one was an engineer that came from a very long term, seen as stodgy computer company. I will not name them, but they were not like the sexy computer company. And we looked at it and was like, oh, this isn't going to work. Like they come from so and so. That's so big, so red tape, so old, so conservative, so everything. And we took a chance. I don't, who knows why we actually took the chance to have the conversation, like you said.
Yep.
And what he was able to do was explain, oh, I was part of the team that was always thinking about new ideas.
Yep.
And he was frustrated because a lot of those ideas didn't take because he worked for the more conservative, stodgy company, but he was actually part of like the SWAT team to think about it.
Yep.
And so he was able to describe that. It was like, okay, so I don't want to say startup in a big company because that's still different, but that concept.
Absolutely.
And then I think the other example is, again, someone who was building things for the first time for a company. So even though she was part of a very big corporate entity, the work she did was new to them because as they were considering of going into a new market, she was doing some analysis of that. So again, it was startup-y even in this huge thing. And so she had to talk about, well, we had never built this before. And so this is how I thought about it. This is who I had to work with. And this is how we decided if it was go or no go. So we're bringing it back into the work that they want you to do is what is key, is doing that translation. You always give the answer, tell them the answer. So that's what you need to be able to figure out.
Yeah, absolutely. That's such a good point. Like any opportunity where you can either, hey, I was actually the first hire in this department and I had to build out this specialty, or even, I walked into a department that was fairly antiquated and I was able to change things and put in new processes and bring things up to speed and innovate on any opportunity where you are building and proactively building, because that can be pretty impressive if, okay, you worked in this, clunky, very slow moving organization, but you still fought through that to try and get new ideas out there is always very impressive. So that's a really good point.
So final point, compensation. Compensation at a big company will look different than compensation at a startup company. Even honestly, different stages of startups, the compensation looks different, but just in general. So things to think about are, it may not just be about the cash, because especially an earlier stage company may not have a ton of cash to give you. So what, one really big bank can give you is going to be different than an emerging startup. So there's cash. There might be more in bonus versus salary because the bonus is sort of like performative and you've earned it, versus salary I'm just giving you constantly.
Yep.
There's probably equity. There may also be different kinds of perks. Benefits may look different. So just sort of acknowledging that a comp package is going to look different, period. Like that alone is the first sentence. But then when people ask you, well, what are your comp expectations? How should I answer it? Because I don't know how the startup might pay versus my big company that used to pay.
And I think it's pretty fair, and they understand that on the startup side, that and that's probably the concern when you're looking at the resume. It's like, okay, do they really are they going to make the transition into this small, nimble culture that we've got, and also how expensive are they, because they're probably making X amount of dollars. So I think if you're really excited about it, just being open and leading with transparency of like, this is ballpark where I'm at within this organization. I'm open and flexible to sort of getting to a place that would make sense in different ways, and it's the entire package that that really interests me, and just give them a sense of like, this is where I'm at. I definitely have flexibility, and kind of put the ball in their court to see how, because usually as a recruiter, I'll say, that is a little higher than our budget, but there's all these other levers of how we put together an offer. So as long as you're okay with being a little heavier bonus, or you're really interested in what we're building and you find a lot of promise in it, so the company's heavy equity, like how comfortable are you with that, et cetera, et cetera. But leading with a little bit of transparency is probably the best way.
Yeah, because the worst scenario is, you're at whatever 150 and we're going to be at 75, and the gap is too big. So that's often why recruiters will ask up front to have some of those conversations. Honestly, though, nowadays you might have some advantage as a candidate of getting a sense of where they're going to be, because there are now so many states that have pay transparency laws that it probably in the posting you'll see it, or if you don't see it for that company, you'll see other companies posting it because they're either New York or Washington or all these different states that you have to do that.
Yep, absolutely.
Awesome. Well, hopefully this was really helpful for folks. We really wanted, because we hear so many people say, well, I want to go to a startup. I want to join a startup. We've been in startups, so we know what it's like on the other side of the table, but we also wanted to better prep candidates, or if this is something you're considering, what are all the things you need to consider to figure out what startup you want to go to, how to present yourself in the best way as a candidate, and then some things to think about as you go through the process that might be different between big company and startup. So we always wrap up this season with one peek behind the curtain. I can go first this week if you'd like me to. Mine was kind of going back to that initial thing that we were talking about, is that we were trying to figure it out as they go. It is often, we are also trying to figure out the interview process, the role, because it might be the first time we're hiring this role. So not only as a company are we figuring things out, we may be figuring things out for this specific role. So we might add someone to the interview process because as we're going through it, we're like, oh, we should add so-and-so because we've never gotten anyone to this stage. So the stage might sort of evolve as we go. It might be as we meet candidates, we have to adjust our own ideas of what this role is going to be. Maybe we were looking for a unicorn and that unicorn doesn't exist. So we might have to adjust. So we may pause you at some point because we're trying to meet some other candidates to get some calibration points. It might be that we say no, but we actually end up coming back because we changed what the role looked like. So be a little patient with us on the recruiting and hiring side, because we're potentially figuring it out as we go as well.
Yeah, that's a good one. Especially in these, small startups moving very quickly, that can equate to the interview process too. And I would say be wary of interview processes that seem too quick, or you didn't meet a lot of people and you get an offer after meeting, two people within the company. Like we've talked a lot about in this conversation of, make sure you're painting the picture and you understand what you're walking into. And I've seen it 1,000 times of like, interviewing can be stressful. So when someone tells you you're done after, two conversations, that can be pretty exciting.
Yeah.
But don't be afraid to try and inform the interview process too. Like to your point, they're kind of figuring it out. So if you feel like it would be helpful to meet, hey, I'd love to meet somebody on the finance side, or would it be possible to meet the CEO? You can even ask that of the recruiter in the beginning of like, get them to paint the whole process for you. And then as you go along, see what other conversations would be helpful for you. Because there's a lot of times where it goes quickly. You don't understand the full scope of what the position is or what the reality of the circumstances of the company that you're walking into. And then it doesn't go well.
Yeah. That is an awesome one. I love that. And it also shows your level of interest. Like, I want to make sure I'm making the right decision, and that impacts your company too. So I would love to meet this person or whatever. That would excite me as a recruiter or hiring person.
Yep, absolutely. It's not out of bounds. And as a recruiter, like if you're a good candidate, I'm going to bend over backwards to try and make that happen. And for the most part, even a CEO, if they have the time and, depending on the stage and the size of the company, would be excited about meeting people and selling the company and his vision or his or her vision. So take that opportunity for sure.
I love it. All right, my friends, as always, we hope this was helpful. We are pulling from our experiences, but also the experiences of our clients. So if some of this resonated with you or you have follow-up questions, let us know. We'd love to hear from you and see how we could help. Dan, always good to see you. Thank you, as always, for your brilliance and expertise.
Great to see you, my friend.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you so much for listening to the Shine at Work podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. And make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel for the video versions of our episodes. To learn more about how you can work with Dan and I to make your next big career move, go to our website, shineatwork.net, or follow us on Instagram at shine_at_work. See you at the next episode.